Hey everyone, I'm Caitlin, and sex sells. Or does it?
Oh, cliffhanger. Okay, and I'm Zach, and I'm gonna do what every responsible white male should do in this situation and listen. So I'm gonna be, just here to listen and put my foot in my mouth probably 3 or 4 times. So we'll
And
do our best.
welcome to Manipulating the Masses. Ah,
Boom, bam, bam, ding, 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 ding. All right, let's do this. Let's
yeah,
do this.
let's do this.
Okay.
Okay, Zach, how nervous are you on a scale of 1 to
Ah.
10?
Like I feel like I'm, riding a roller coaster that like tick 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 when you're like going up to the and you're just like that level nervous. Like it's important, but it's gonna be a ride. It's gonna be a
No
ride.
joke, I'm actually a little nervous to talk about this too because I also feel like I'm going to put my foot in my mouth. And I'm sorry, we didn't even preface what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about we're going to be breaking down gender roles in advertising. So we're going to be looking at some of the earliest ads dating back to the 1800s, and we're just going to keep walking
Oh
through
wow.
history up until the 70s, and then I'm going to leave us on a cliffhanger. That's right, I'm going to break this up into two
Oh,
parts.
okay. Oh, I love it. Yes. Okay. Two-parter. I
I've
love
decided
it. Let's do it.
I'm making history here at Manipulating the Masses podcast, and we're going to do our first
Oh,
podcast. Yep.
I love it. That is an extra hour for me to put my foot in my mouth. So
Yes.
amazing. Perfect.
Um,
Perfect.
so the reason why I am going to leave us on a cliffhanger around the 70s is because we're going to be paying special attention to stereotyping gender roles in advertising, and then
Mm.
how it quickly shifted to the hyper sexualization of women that we actually
Oh,
are still kind of seeing even in 2020. But it's
I
really
agree.
important to note that point, that shift happened in the 70s. So I want to dedicate an entire podcast to the hypersexualization of women. This one's
Oh,
going to
love
be
it.
exploring gender roles.
Okay. Love that.
Yeah. So again, this might be a mini episode. I don't know. This could be our first two-parter and it could be our first mini.
That's
Um,
cool. Cool with
yeah.
me. Let's do it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Less chances for either of us to put our foot in our mouth.
Yeah.
So as I always like to do, I always like to, well, not always, but I do like to kick us off with a quote. So this
Yes.
one was from Kalle Lawson, and I apologize if I butchered that name. He's an Estonian Canadian filmmaker, author, magazine editor, and activist. And he stated,
Mm.
corporate advertising is the largest single psychological project ever undertaken by the human race. Yet, for all of that, its impact on us remains unknown and largely ignored. When I think of media's
Mm.
influence over years, over decades, I think of those brainwashing experiments conducted by Dr. Ewan Cameron in a Montreal psychiatric hospital in 1950. Those experiments were
Mm.
the idea of CIA sponsored depatterning experiments to outfit conscious, unconscious, or semi conscious subjects with headphones and flood their brains with thousands of repetitive, quote, driving messages that would alter their behavior over
Yeah.
time. Advertising aims to do the exact same thing. Yeah, pause.
Yes.
Let's
Love.
pause
Great
here.
quote. Great
What do you
quote.
what do you
Great
think
quote.
about that? Do you feel like you're under advertisements control? Like, did that quote like make you feel yucky?
Yes, yeah, yes, and yes. I do think we're under advertisements control. We have not only is it a constant, I mean, in a sense that we don't even realize it, like it's constantly bombarding us. We've talked about it before. Our eye line is monetized everywhere. I'm looking out my window, one, two, three, four ads. I can see out my window, right? Like it's everywhere and it's constantly being hit. And because it's everywhere, we don't notice them all, but we still like consciously, subconsciously register them.
I 100% agree,
It's so
and
true.
for me, I'm not gonna put you on the spot, but maybe you can talk to this, is like, I remember when I really thought about this, I remember my childhood being influenced by advertising. And I am pretty well known in the company for kind of idolizing Gucci campaigns. And even from a
Yeah,
very early age, I knew I wanted to work in fashion, whatever that was. And when I was younger, I didn't understand that there were so many more facets of fashion advertising. So I just wanted to be a model
yeah,
because I was so heavily influenced by the campaigns that I saw in magazines. And really kind of looking back
yeah.
on it, it wasn't the like a necessarily I didn't want to be a model. I wanted to be a part of the glamour that was
Mm,
advertising. So I feel like
yeah,
it influenced
yeah.
me very early on. Do you remember a time or a pivotal moment in your life when advertising influenced you, a print ad?
Yeah, no, not so much print ads. I would say mine was definitely TV commercials, right?
Mm,
Like we consumed, even as kids, we were in the age where we're watching TV all the time, right? Like little, Nickelodeon, Disney Channel, like when you're a kid, like
yeah,
all of those shows. And
yeah,
those are just peppered with ads, right? We've talked about it.
yeah.
Those ads sell for a lot, toys, whatever, minivans now.
Because they know
Yeah,
the
you're
buying
influenced.
power of kids.
Yep, yep.
Mhm,
And not only that, like funny commercials that would make me laugh because they're showing them so many times, like are memorable, right? And
mhm.
I remember wanting to be in advertising and wanting to write funny commercials, I thought that would just
Yeah.
sounded so much fun, like to
Uh-huh.
write little funny commercials. So, yeah, the sense that we're aware of it as a kid of that advertising is a thing, I think is a new thing for our generation. Like we are consciously aware of it from the time we are a child.
Mhm.
Um, Amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm glad we talked about that. That might be the last time you have a voice in this podcast.
Good. Yep. Let me sip my coffee and let's
Just sit
time to
back.
listen. Yeah, time to
So,
listen.
again, I just wanted to explore the history of how we got to where we are. So we saw our first gender stereotypical ad pop up in the 1800s. And I think it's important to know
Wow.
how men and women in society were treated in the 1800s. And this doesn't come as anything new, anything shocking, anything as a surprise, but men and women had physically different makeups. And actually, I'll pause here and say I even tried to go way farther back and figure out how did even the 1800s start to define those gender roles. And there's
Yeah.
so many theses out there that I just didn't have the time or the bandwidth to really dive into fucking gender studies. Um,
Yeah.
but I think, stating the obvious, it's men are physically stronger than women. And so their genetic makeup made them stronger back in the days when it was just hunting and gathering. So that
Yeah.
was kind of men's role, and the women were to, take care of the children. They had their defined roles.
Mm,
Um,
hmm.
in the 1800s, it started kind of expanding those roles. So not only were men stronger, but they were seen as more intelligent. Along with strength came courage, determination. So
Mm,
all of these really great qualities that come hand in hand with strength, men were starting to own those qualities. Whereas women were really taking a back seat, even though keeping care of the household is still a strong quality, they were taking on more
yeah.
kind of lesser adjectives, lesser qualities. So they were
Yeah.
seen as
Yeah.
governed by their emotions. Their virtues were expected to be modesty, compassion, chastity.
Mm,
Men were thought to be more aggressive, again, really just a synonym for strength, and women were more
yeah.
passive. In the late 19th centuries, significant change in gender roles started to happen, which really led to these separate fears. So back in the day, men would contribute, women would contribute to one household, and they really had their parts. But in the 19th century, they started to separate those roles and separate those spheres. So the growing influence of evangelical ideology
Ugh,
placed on females were domesticity, virtue. Women's bodies were no longer, seen as just a body. It was you were bred to have children. You
ugh,
were the angel of the house. So,
yeah,
and any women who failed to meet those expectations were really chastised and looked at as prostitutes with uncontrollable
uh-huh.
sexual desires. Um, and
Oh my
for
goodness.
men, it's argued that increasingly public life and work was confined to men while women were expected to stay home. So those are kind of the two separating spheres that men and women were operating
Yeah,
in. So i-
interesting.
in the 1800s, we really saw ads promoting these roles. Women had their role and men had their role. Again, this first ad I'm going to show us. Oh, I can't wait because this is very much a visual podcast. And all of these ads will be on our Facebook group. So please go visit our Facebook group to see all the ads that we're going to be talking about and all of the videos that I'm going to show Zach. Um, so I'm going to start showing you the first example of advertising in 1800. It says, 14-hour wives of 8-hour men need gold dust washing powder to enable them to get through work as early as their husbands. Gold dust saves time, strength, patience, and money. And this was run in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Montreal. Um,
Okay, okay.
I thought it was
And the
interesting that well, I was like, at first I didn't understand. I was like, what is a 14-hour wife versus an 8-hour man? And I think what they're alluding to is women put in more work than men put in.
yeah, like 14 hours. But I was just like the thing is like why 14 hours, you know? Like they're trying to say
Yeah,
like women are working the house 14 hours while men go out and work an 8-hour shift, right? At the
exactly.
but isn't a wife 24 hours? Isn't being a husband 24 hours?
I know
Like, do you
exactly.
just
Like,
like
what a random
eight
number.
o'clock hits? You're like, yeah, 8 o'clock hits. You're like, I'm done. No more wife shit today. You know, like, boom, put it into work. Um,
Yeah.
okay, yeah. And
So
this was placed in the placements. It looks like it was like in newspapers, right? Like that was the mode of promoting this. Would they put it in newspapers and
yep,
magazines and stuff? Okay,
yep,
cool.
exactly. So this was kind of in the 1800s. This really continued on for decades until the 20s, when of course World War I started having a impact on women's roles.
Look at you quoting World War One.
Well,
Hey, we're getting look at this history podcast is playing yeah, I love it. I
I
love it.
did have to
Hit it.
read a few articles for this specific podcast, so I
But now
figured
we
out
know.
when World War I happened.
Yeah, that's not gender roles either. Okay, maybe that was the first. That's not. We just
No,
know Caitlin from
no,
history is
no,
Caitlin
it's
specifically
not my
is
area.
yeah.
It's not my area. Geography and history I could give a shit about. So the 20s were really the first decade that gave way to this idea of a quote new woman. Women started having the power to vote, obviously. They now
Mm,
had opportunities in employment and education and the expanding concept of a woman's place. However, marriage still remained the ultimate goal
yeah,
for women. So
yeah.
even though they were allowed to vote and they were starting to have more power in society, it was still marriage was the end
Do
all
you
be
still
all.
feel that that's the same way today growing up in like as a quote unquote modern woman? Did you still get a lot of that influence that like everything was geared towards marriage? Or
Absolutely not.
oh really? Okay, so you think it's
I've
changed.
never idolized and this is just me, of course, But I've never idolized the idea of marriage or finding a man. It was always very career centric. But
Yeah,
everyone has
good.
e everyone plays a different role, and that was kind of what I idealized and my parents brought me up with.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I just think in the well, you didn't grow up in the Midwest either. Maybe it was different my experience, but I'm not a woman, but I could say like a lot of the women that I knew and growing up, they loved it. What I would say is they loved the idea of marriage, which was crazy to me. Like they just loved the idea, but they didn't know who they were going to be married to, and I think that's the difference. But they were, and I don't know, that's probably has a lot to do with advertising and influence outside of it. They were really marriage was a focus and something that was always, if not in the forefront of their head, the back of their head, right? Like marriage was a big goal in life, a big stepping stone. Um,
I'm
yeah,
so happy you prompted this discussion because now you're really making me think about it. And I did idealize my wedding. So it wasn't the
yeah,
idea of marriage, it was the wedding that I was like,
exactly.
I was a stereotypical little girl who had like dresses on the wall, and that totally
Hmm.
had everything to do with advertising, 100%. Because I was sold this idea of this is your moment to look the most beautiful that you could possibly ever look in your
Yep.
life. Like, this is the pinnacle of what a woman will be,
Yeah.
is on your wedding day.
Yeah.
Um, and so I do remember that from a very early age of I cut out wedding
Yeah.
dresses
Yeah. And you're not
as a
alone,
kid.
right? You're definitely not
Yeah.
alone.
So while women in the 20s were finding their footing in society, advertising was still encouraging women to believe that their economic security and social status depended on successful
Mm,
marriage. So, working women became the consumers of popular products and fashion. Women who, as an example, would never tolerate chewing tobacco or cigars were now being sold relatively clean and mild cigarettes. So
mm,
cigarettes were kind of the first brand to start advertising to women, with
mm.
the modern sophistication of look dainty, look cute. But
Yeah.
we understand that you have buying power, so we are going to market to you versus the man. Um,
Yeah.
and that's really where the stereotypical like flapper image that you think of in the 20s came to be, where women are holding like a very
Yeah.
long, slender cigarette.
I
Um,
was gonna say that is
so
elegant. Like that's the image that came to my
it
head too. That
is.
long slender. It is
Yes.
elegant. Like you look
Yes.
very elegant with that. Um, can't
Mhm.
argue with that.
During the wars 1 and 2, the advertising really shifted again into understanding the buying power that women had. And they continued to idolize the perfect life as one that was subservient to their husbands. So not only
Mm,
were women supposed to be homemakers, but they were supposed to be homemakers that looked good and made their man feel good. So that's almost
yeah.
what I appreciated looking back. And this is where I might put my foot in my mouth. But like looking back on the advertisements in the 1800s, where it was like, okay, we're defining roles. The men work, the women are the homemakers. Like those are two separate roles, and they both owned those roles. And now
Yeah.
we're seeing this shift as women not only had a role, but they had an extra role to be subservient to men and
Yeah.
support their
Yeah.
man on a day-to-day
Yep.
basis.
Yeah. Very
So
interesting. And I think, can we go back to your quote? What was his name? I'm sorry. The Estonian
Calais
Canadian filmmaker.
Lassen.
Calais Lassen, the quote from Calais Lassen, because this is where I think it gets interesting, is now we've seen advertising over decades and decades and decades promoting this. So what I think it's almost advertising inception, where their parents of the women in the 30s and 40s, 20s, 30s, and 40s got fed this advertisement to be subservient. And as you're growing up and you're a little girl, your influences, you're going to get fed ads that are telling you this. In addition, your parents were fed ads that they bought into, that they believe it. So it just keeps the status quo because you're getting these major influences that have been manipulated by ads in both directions. So your independent mind is getting
Generationally.
manipulated. Yeah, yeah, like your independent mind is getting manipulated by these ads, and as well as your like respect for your parents and learning from your parents has been manipulated by these ads as well. So it's over this trended time, which is amazing, if not sad in this
Mhm.
case, but uh, amazing.
The next ad I'm going to show you is yeah, from this era where women were not only the homemaker. And I just want to kind of go back to this ad from the 1800s, and I'm going to describe it to our listeners. It's black and white, and it's a household setting, and the woman is down on all fours. She's in kind of an apron and a cleaning outfit, and she's scrubbing the floors. That's the image portrayed in the 1800s. Now I'm showing an ad from the 1920s or 30s, and it's this beautiful woman, glamorous. It's a glamour shot. She's all made up, done up, and she has a pack of cigarettes in her hand, and it says "After a Man's Heart." So the portrayal of women was also shifting. It wasn't just like the messaging, you have to look good and take care of the home and um support your husband. The visual of women, this was the ideal to aspire to
Do
be.
you know, because the woman in this ad has a backless dress, right? Like her
Yeah.
entire, would you know, is this considered risque for the time? Was this considered like, you know, talking about the
Yeah.
hypersexualization, was this considered to be like, oh my gosh, like you can see her back? Um,
It is an interesting choice,
yeah.
right? Like she could have been facing the front. But instead the advertisement has her looking away. Well, her back is facing the viewer, and you see all of her back.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it was risque. I think it promoted actually kind of an upper middle class,
Yeah, gotcha.
um, because money was scarce during
Mm-hmm.
the wars.
Mm-hmm.
So this really was kind of like the influencer that women aspired to be and
Yeah.
look like.
Can you read the
Then we move
tagline? Sorry, can you read the tagline below her? Because it says, After a man's heart." I'm just wondering how they finished that.
after a man's heart, dot, dot, dot. When smokers find out the good things Chesterfields give them, nothing else will do.
Well,
Hmm.
that doesn't even make any sense. I'm not following that.
I don't think it's like even a sentence.
Yeah, it's that's
After a man's heart, dot, dot, dot. When smokers find out the good things Chesterfields give them, nothing else will do. Anyways,
oh, the man part
the
just
next
feels out of
ad,
place. The man part feels very out of place. Yeah.
right. Um, the next ad is a sketch. It's not a photograph. It's a sketch of a woman, and it says, "You 5 million women who want to get married. How's your breath today?"
Whoa.
Yeah, I loved that one.
How's your breath today?
So, women's femininity was being called into question. So, you had to look good, you had to smell good, you had to, everything was for marriage, for the man.
Mm, mm-hmm.
Um, in this era of advertising, and again, I'm talking about kind of post World War One, going into post World or going into World War Two. Women and girls were promised success. Their idea of success was they were promised success if they were slim, wore makeup, waited on their husband's hand and foot, while men
Yeah.
and boys were
Yeah.
promised success if they drank expensive liquor, joined the military, and did hard labor jobs. So those were two very different ideas of the successful person.
Yeah, so you would drink expensive liquor and work hard labor jobs? I mean, it goes hand in hand, but it just doesn't seem like, you're working hard
I
labor
mean,
jobs, you gotta drink expensive liquor. I don't know about
totally,
that.
totally. And that when I think of television in the 60s, I think of a man coming home from work and asking for dinner to be ready and a cold beer.
Yep,
Like they had to
yep,
drink hard, expensive liquor to kind of go
yep.
back and earn an income for their home. So
And the
that
wife
is
is
what was being
vacuuming
pushed
with
on.
high heels on. Yeah, the wife is vacuuming with
Yes,
high heels
yes,
on, like, that's it, like, geez.
yes.
That never made sense to me, those old ads with, like, the women cleaning in high heels, like, that sounds terrible. Like, who does that? Sounds awful. Oh my god.
I pulled an ad from that era and it said, buy her a Hoover vacuum. And it showed the exact same image that you're describing uh, of a woman in heels vacuuming. So, yeah.
What?
Um, so, moving into the 60s and the 70s, this is when, oh, wait, I'm so sorry. I totally forgot to. I want to talk about the video that I had you watch.
Mm,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
I'm gonna listen. So this is again, this is World War II, where things were kind of scarce. Um, and I'm gonna play this for our listeners. So this is an ad from 1946, kind of in the style of musical comedy. This is something I had you watch. So
Mhm,
I'm gonna play it for our listeners, and then I just kind of want to have an open discussion about this.
mhm.
You can't hear it.
No, I can hear it.
Nice day for a wedding. The skies are wonderful
Drop the beat. Hey.
blue. Nice day.
So if you can't listen, if you can't make out what they're saying this is a depiction of a newlywed couple and they're singing to each other. Zach is bopping in the background, and
Mm,
they're saying it's a nice day to be married, especially to a beautiful girl like you.
To be married,
yeah.
especially to a beautiful girl like you. Heaven's around the corner. The month, of course, it's June. Such a nice day, a cheese and rice day. And here we are, dear, on our honeymoon. Darling, just a moment, rush me not this way. Simply got to tell them how you're here today. I was dressed.
I'll stop it there. um I will
You
say
didn't
that
even let him
that
get to the brand part, though.
I know not
Yeah,
the
because, like, at first I was like, well, I think we got to play it through because, like, it turns into a commercial, right? Like,
it does.
yeah.
I Okay, let's play it through. Let's play it through.
I've been
So we have
weary.
a couple. We
It
have
looked
I think
like
20 more seconds.
this. Till that puzzle dazzle changed my name from Miss. You too can puzzle dazzle. Your eyes, your colors will be brighter with puzzle dazzle. You really have the personality.
Purcell Adelaide. Oh my God. How long do you
Hmm.
think it took them to come up with that?
I thought it was a
No,
home
probably
run.
not too long. They were like, we got to rhyme. We got to rhyme with international,
Personality.
whatever they rhyme with.
Yeah.
Oh, they have to rhyme with personality. So they're like, oh,
Personality.
personality.
Monday
All
will
right.
be a fun day. Oh yes, it really will. No rehearsal when you use puzzle. Your first time means a puzzle dazzle thrill.
Oh, it gets funky at the end. That music break at the end
Woo!
gets that gets funky. That's
What
like,
a ride.
what a ride.
I knew.
So these are like the OG, sorry, these are like the OG TV commercials though, right? Like TV
Yes.
is brand new. These
Yes.
are like the OG. Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
And this was so I knew this ad was going to be offensive in some way. And it was advertising a cleaning product or sorry, a laundry
Yeah.
detergent, Persil, um, which obviously is no longer in business due to this ad.
Yeah.
I'm just
Yeah.
kidding. It's not due to this ad, but uh where I really like felt offended was where I stopped it initially and she said, "Oh, it's a nice day for a wedding, but hold up. Let me stop and tell the people why I am even here. And why you're here. It's because at first I looked like this. I was drab and dreary. That's what she said. And she comes
Ugh.
out in this
Yeah.
really, it's actually not even, it's just a different dress, but she considers it drab
Mm-hmm.
and dreary. And then she started using Persil laundry detergent and she changed her name from Miss to Mrs. all because of purple or Persil. And I was like, she just calls herself out for being drab and dreary. Like, where is your self respect, girl? That's where I was like, damn, I knew that would be offensive, but I didn't realize like what type of emotion it would contrive in me. What did you think about the ad? Did you just like laugh the first time you saw it?
Yeah, I mean, it's I knew it was going to be
Yeah,
problematic when I started it,
yeah, same.
but what I felt, from the male perspective was I wanted the guy to acknowledge his awkward phase because men and women go through the same awkward phase, and I wanted him to go through that weird voice changing time, and then he was like, I used to be a little like a little
Actually, that's so
asshole, and
true. That's so true. They could have easily
yeah.
done that. "Hey, I'm the woman, and I used to be drab and dreary, fine." And then the man said, "Oh, I also used to be drab and dreary." And then we both started using Persil,
Yeah.
but it's just so clearly depicts the woman is the only one doing laundry, and she's the only one
Yep.
who looked god awful before she met her Prince Charming, and now they're on their honeymoon and everything is wonderful. Um,
Yeah.
I loved all these ads. Like each one was about 2 minutes. So,
Yep.
us in this day and age, our attention span is not long. So I was like, fuck, I don't want to watch this for 2 minutes.
Really?
And yeah, I
You
actually
know
did.
what?
I watched like every single ad in this
Me
article because it
too.
was so
Me too.
fascinating to me.
Yeah. Me too.
So that was an example of an ad that was being shown to women in the 40s and the 50s. Again, this was a 1946 advertisement. So moving on, I want to, and this is where I'm going to cut our podcast short. This is kind of wrapping up part one of our podcast
Love
is
it. Yeah.
um, by the 60s and the 70s, this is when advertising straight up starts to get offensive. Like, that was kinda like gender roles, but this is straight
Yeah.
up blatantly sexist, and this starts happening in the 70s. Advertisers were able to get away with an ad for, again, feminine hygiene that said, "Feminine odor is everyone's problem." Or
Oh. Oh. Oh.
your reaction,
Oh.
say no more, say no more.
Whoa.
Or a cigarette ad where a woman said, "My boyfriend told me he loved me for my mind. I have never been so insulted in my life."
Oh.
Another one
Oh.
for a construction material which showed a nude woman with sort of large derriere and thighs. And the copy read, "She's built like all of our products, heavy where she has to take the strain."
Oh man. At
Advertisers were
least that
getting
I
away
mean
with this.
that one is at least a little tongue in cheek, like it's not great. Let's preface that. Like not helpful to society, but at least they're a little clever, At least they like there's some innuendo there. It's but like, oh my god.
Okay,
Wow.
this is also where we start I wanna show you some ads. This is where it starts to get real fun. Um,
Oh god.
alright. Here's an ad from Playboy. A woman, bare chested, on the ground, staring at a man's shoe. There's no man in the actual advertisement, and it says, "Keep her where she belongs." She's on the ground,
I,
laying down,
uh,
bare chested, looking at
yeah.
a man's shoe. I'm looking at Zach's face, and he's just like more confused than anything.
I don't understand what that means. I don't understand like kissing the floor that you
That's what
walk
I
on?
was thinking too. That's what I interpreted was kissing the feet of men.
Yeah, like kissing the ground that they walk on,
Yeah.
right? Like that
Yeah.
that's how
Okay.
wow.
Moving on to the next one. This is a cigarette ad. It says, "Blow in her face and she'll follow you anywhere."
Oh my god.
I know.
What?
I know. It's comical how crazy this is. Like this is insane. Um
Has the lingo changed nowadays, or do they know exactly what they're doing as advertisers by saying "blow in her face"? Like, do they know? What?
they yes. I mean, yes.
They had to have
They
known,
had
right?
to.
Like
Lingo
they
has not
had to have known.
changed. It was the
No, right?
70s. It wasn't the 1800s. Like maybe you could have gotten
Yeah.
maybe we could have been like, "Oh, there was a language barrier." No, 70s.
Oh,
Um
no. Oh my god.
so this is a ad. This is actually so it says it's a woman and it says, "I'm Joe, fly me." And she is a female flight attendant. And actually there was a ton of flight attendant advertising that
Mm.
was like over sexualized because women were starting to
Oh,
fly.
well,
Um,
no, because that's why they had stewardesses, because it was a women's only job. Um, the old flight
yes.
attendants, and so they were trying to recruit beautiful women. That was like because men were the main patrons of flying, so they tried to
Yep.
recruit. It was like a whole experience. Ugh. It gives me heebie-jeebies.
Next ad, cigarettes are like women. The best ones are thin and rich. Yeah, so that's all I got. And I would highly recommend going and checking out our Facebook group because I'll be posting all of these advertisements in the group and they are just comical at best.
Oh my god, they're great in a
So,
comic way. Let's
and
preface
it's
that.
interesting because the 70s were such a progressive time for women. Like this was really where the advances in politics and medicine, women were able to start thinking about careers as well as jobs. So they weren't just like going to a factory
Mm,
and work in the factory line. They were really starting to think of themselves in careers. Um, and
yeah,
they were
yeah.
able to consider divorce for the first time. So women in society were
Oh,
actually empowered. However, that wasn't reflected in advertising. They were able to start thinking about their lives playing out on somewhat equal footing. Um, but even at the height of this women's liberation in the 70s, products aimed to female consumers were actually marketed to men. And this is where I want to stop this part one and go into part two, where advertising moved away from a reflection of society into telling society what it wants. So I just kind of gave you
oh,
a brief
hmm,
history of the 1800s, 20s, 50s, and the 70s, where it was a reflection of the gender roles. But now advertising
yeah.
has the power to tell society what it wants. So I thought that was really interesting. So that's, yeah.
Interesting. Interesting.
Not to mention that
Hmm.
advertising was predominantly white male run.
Oh,
So
yeah. Oh,
white men
definitely.
were
Definitely.
were not portraying how women actually were living their lives in society. They were portraying how they wanted women to live their lives. And it was
Yeah.
almost like
Yep.
women were getting too much power. Like there was too much liberation, where in the good old days, like the 50s and the 60s, now men were maybe like a little pissed off. They were like, let's bring it back a little bit. Let's bring it back a couple decades.
Yep.
So
Yep. You see that
I
now
think,
with diversity. I think oh, I was just
yes,
gonna say, I think we see that now trending with diversity
yes,
because, you watch commercials now, and I would say, a good majority of them or a good amount of them feature interracial couples and people of minority in the advertising, right?
yes,
And that is, I think that advertising has led to a lot of kickback from white
yes,
males that want to keep the old status quo, right? We see that battle just playing out again and again and again.
yes,
It's
because we're
fascinating.
challenging them to do better. We're saying, hey, we're on your
Hmm.
coattails. um you no longer get to be mediocre at your jobs, at your careers. We're coming up
Yep.
quick,
Yep.
and we're starting to gain momentum. And yeah, so to your point,
Yep.
diversity, that's what's happening now, where you see like these white supremacy groups kind trying to pop up all over the state because people are challenging their idea of what is supreme.
Yep.
You aren't, yeah. So
Yep. Yep.
I like that discussion, and maybe we
Or
can,
what's being portrayed.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, a- and maybe we can talk about that when we do talk about advertising in the 80s, the 90s, and today, because that is really, so we went from blatantly sexist. And then the 80s and the 90s, that's where we see hypersexuality. And that's, I grew up in the 90s, you
Mm,
grew up in the 90s. That's really where I started getting my idea of the ideal woman's body type. So I'm really excited to dip into
yep.
that, and that's why I do think that that deserves its own podcast in itself. But I kind of wanted to open this up to a marketing discussion, and I don't, let I don't know if this will go anywhere, but
Yeah.
you run ad campaigns. And we've talked about this before. I'm very much the creative side. You're very much the numbers, the analytic, the execution, I would say. I come up with the visuals, you
Yeah.
execute on those visuals. So in a hypothetical situation, if you had all of today's tools at your fingertips, and we're running an ad like this in the 70s, how would you go about running this? Who would you market it to? How would you get it to people? What audience would you choose? How would you feed it to them?
Yeah, so we're talking about like placing. That's a great question. If I had modern tools,
Yeah.
if I was running it with the modern tools, I think the first thing that popped into my head was that cigarette ad we saw from the 40s, where the woman has her back to the off. I think A/B testing and modern. If we had a modern one where you just swap out the woman and you have different women with the same tagline and the same to try
To
to
see which
appeal
one
to
performed
different
better.
markets.
I like
Exactly,
that.
exactly. So I
Even to kind of spin off of that too, like potentially switching it out with a man, or potentially
mhm, mhm,
maybe we spent a little bit time talking about just her back. Maybe she's facing forward in one ad while her
yep,
back. So there are little details that I loved that you picked up on back when we were discussing that one particular ad, that now in today's society we can tweak and we can figure out what
yep,
performs better and how to market it to the audience that you want. So I think maybe now that I asked you that,
yep.
I think in a lot of ways the way that we market is a little bit um healthier, or uh is maybe for the greater good, because we can see what is performing. Like, what if that woman of the ad
I
didn't
mean, greater
perform
good
as well?
for the brands.
Yeah. But I mean, what
Yeah.
if that woman
Yeah,
of the
greater,
ad
yeah, for the brands, right?
didn't perform as well as the man, right? Like, you ran an A/B test, one was of
Mm.
a woman, one was of a man, and the man actually outperformed the women. That could have altered history,
Yeah, yeah. I
because you
totally
could have
agree.
found
If it
out
had
that
like the metrics.
if you could have found out that the man performed better than the woman, okay, advertising now only features men smoking cigarettes, and you're not moving into this movement of hypersexualizing women, to cater to the male gaze, because you understand that it's not performing.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And you
And
can make, and if it didn't perform, right? But what if it did? Like what if it did
it
perform and
just
you're
gets
just like
worse.
buying in? Exactly. So I think you have an optimistic view. I have a very pessimistic view of that I
Well,
think.
I think also what I want to get into in the next podcast is like this idea that sex really doesn't sell, but
Mm,
advertising wants it to sell so badly. And in the 70s we saw that, of women really being subservient to men and submissive and being this sexual object, but women weren't buying into that at all, but they didn't have any metrics to
mm.
figure that out. Like, sure, well, of course they do. You have sales. That's how you measure whether advertising is working
Yeah.
or not. You have
Yeah.
sales.
But you
But
can't credit that to an ad in a magazine either,
exactly.
right? Like that there we tell clients that now print's great if you want visibility, but you can't really tie that. And there's a few ways you could do it nowadays, but old school, no way to tie that directly to sales. No way.
How do you measure print advertising? How do you measure the ROI on that
Nowadays,
now, nowadays?
yeah, there's a few ways you can do it. So you can have one is like a landing page, a vanity URL that you only put into the print ad. So people go directly
Mm.
www dot whatever cigarettes dot slash golf digest, like if you place that in golf digest, so you can have that vanity URL and then measure how many people go to that. You can have a call tracking phone number in the print ad that's specially tailored to that ad, so you can measure how many times somebody's called that number that you ran in the print ad. But really, like, that's about it. Otherwise, it's kind of like radio at this point, where like radio is fine, you can run ads on the radio, but really there is lacking of tracking. Oh, look at me rhyme. Lacking of
Lacking of
tracking
tracking.
from radio from radio to digital. Like there's no way to bridge that gap, right? Like
Yeah.
they try it, but it sucks. So
Unless
yeah.
you have a point, you say, go visit, I think of podcast advertisements. It's like, yeah, go get your shampoo. Madison Reed is a big fucking advertiser that that comes across my feed. Madison Reed backslash
Yeah.
morbid to get your 25% discount
Hmm.
code, so you know exactly
Yep.
where
Yep.
that traffic came from.
Yep, exactly. And that's just them trying to get ROI on podcast ads, right? Same thing
Mhm.
if you have a special code in a magazine and you go to the website checkout and you use that special code, they know they saw this from the magazine ad. So
Mhm.
there is ways to translate print nowadays. Um, Old school style, and what we were talking about 70s, zero. I mean, they didn't have online, but like zero way to really trace sales to ads, right? There's
Well,
there's a really rough line.
yeah. I would argue that maybe in the 70s there was. Right now there's so many different ways to advertise and being shown an ad. You have TV, you have movies, you have podcasts, you have what blogs, you have what
Yeah.
so many different ways to get traffic to your product. However, back in the day, you had one way, and that was to show print advertising. This was before TV commercials were a thing or whatever.
Or
So
TV. Yeah,
if you
70s. No, 70s had TV.
No,
70s.
totally,
The
totally,
70s
they
had
did.
TV.
I was kinda thinking even, like, prior to the '70s is, um
Oh, yep, 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 yep.
is if you did see an increase and a spike in traffic, you knew that your ad was working. So you could actually monitor those metrics. But now, yeah, the '70s, the '80s, and the '90s had a couple of different ways to advertise. And so you didn't really know
Yeah.
what was working and what wasn't.
Hmm.
And now we
God,
get
to
to,
be a marketer back then, where yeah, to be a marketer now, like if we run a good campaign and it's getting our client sales, we have to prove it. We're like, this is why it got sales. Like
yeah,
back in the day, oh, no wonder white men thrive. They could be mediocre. They could be
yeah,
like, yeah, we ran this ad. You're doing
yeah,
well in sales. We'll take credit for it.
yeah,
Like, and there's no way to disprove that.
yeah.
White men thrive in that environment.
It was all creative. That was the difference. Creative
Yeah,
ruled the
yeah,
world, and now data and analytics rule the world.
yep.
Messaging.
And
All
here I am,
right.
a white man in the data and analytics. Yeah,
Yeah,
trying to
right?
rule the
Oh my
world.
God, you're the next wave of the '70s advertising man.
Oh God. Oh God. Oh, I'm cutting that out. I'm not gonna let that go to the final edit.
Um, cool. Well, that kind of concludes the part one of gender roles in advertising. So just to recap, we went through the 1800s, the 1920s, the 1970s. We went from clearly defined gender roles to women being a little bit subservient, to women being totally just an object of a male gaze. And now the
Mm,
next episode, we're going to explore the hypersexuality that came out of the '70s. And to our
okay.
credit, to society's credit, we are in a safer space of advertising now. There's a lot of gender neutrality
Yeah.
happening. Um,
Yeah.
so I want to explore all of that in episode 2. So follow along.